Hey, welcome back to Chant Talk. I'm your host, Patrick Torsel, and today we've got another special guest on the show. We've got Rick Wheeler, who is a friend and mentor of mine and former boss. Rick is the music director at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which is a priestly fraternity of St. Peter, FSSP parish in Littleton, Colorado. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to Rick. Rick, introduce yourself. Tell us about your background in music and how you kind of landed where you are now.
Oh, you're too kind, Patrick. Well, let's see. Background. I was in high school, trained vocally and on piano by Maestro Michael Massaletti, who has since retired many years ago. He was a Juilliard baby, and he was really meticulous about tuning and tone, and taught me a lot initially about singing. I then continued my education at Westminster Choir College in Princeton, which is also now a defunct school, of all things, and learned a lot about bel canto singing and did a fair amount of large sound bel canto singing as a tenor, and kind of started getting in touch with my countertenor. But when I moved to New York and started working for my master's and my doctorate in New York, learned a lot more about early music than I thought could ever happen. And what I found was I enjoyed pure tone singing a lot more than I actually enjoyed bel canto singing. It seemed to me that bel canto was a race to see how big and bad your voice could sound no matter what you did.
Right.
And I liked the pure tone singing because it gave a chance for my voice to really flourish and to do some much more subtle things.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and it also seems like you can blend a lot better with other voices with pure tone as well, right?
Yeah, well, that was another thing I noticed that really kind of stuck out at me is when working in bel canto, it kind of works if you have a larger choir and you're doing a larger work and they're all singing kind of in conjunction with the orchestra. But when you're doing 3, 4, 5, 6 per part, maybe a true chamber choir size, I found that the bel canto can take away, especially if you have several different varying vibratos, of which different schools teach. You know, some schools teach a very large, very healthy vibrato, a very dramatic vibrato. Others are, and if you listen to recordings from the 1920s and 30s, most of the vibratos are a little tighter, a little more pinched. So you get a less of a blending quality of the voice. So that was a big thing for me. And I performed in New York as a ringer for about 7 years, just couldn't take it after that. It was too intense. I had a conversion. I converted to the Catholic faith and was doing little bits and pieces of music, took my test in seminary, found out that I was not supposed to have a vocation.
You and me both, Rick.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They just couldn't handle us.
I know.
And then finally found myself in Denver about 20-ish years ago where I was doing some teaching, some other standard music work outside of work, but was always doing music while I was in Denver. So for about 12 years I sang with the Ars Nova Singers, who are heard regularly on NPR. I've been heard on the show Hearts of Space doing Bill Douglas's music. So it was all very modern, but it was really interesting because a lot of it was pure tone modern. There wasn't a lot of bel canto singing there. And then sort of found myself hired by the fraternity when I sat down with Father Jackson and said, well, all these church rules, you know, what's this church rule about chant first and polyphony? I know both of those really well.
Yeah.
And he decided to hire me as a full-time music director in October of 2009. And that's how I ended up at Our Lady of Mount Carmel.
That's fantastic. So now, I mean, you're in, I guess, your 11th year there, and you know, I can certainly personally attest to the amazing quality of your music program and the growth too. You know, I was there with you for what was it, about 4 years as your organist.
Sure.
And even in the 4 years that I was there, the growth of the program, not just the physical growth, but I mean the musical growth.
Sure.
Was quite remarkable, and I'm sure it's continued to improve since I was there. But well, tell us a little bit about what your program looks like at this point, what your choir looks like. Tell us about it.
Well, currently we're looking at 6 actual hired voices that are on the payroll. I have some ringers and subs that'll come in on occasion. We got to host Maestro David Hughes, who flew out to help us sing the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. because unfortunately, due to all of the COVID restrictions and lockdowns, many of the musicians that I normally work with in Denver were kind of worried about doing too much outside singing, outside of their comfort zone. So we found some musicians, one of which used to be a section leader. Our old soprano section leader came back to sing with us, as did Mr. Hughes, and they both just added a tremendous amount to the sound to include those 6 other people that we paid, and then I've got 3 or 4 other ringers who come in on occasionally that I will pay per mass to sing with our group. They then blend in with the volunteer choir, which is, I find, it's a way of taking amateurs beyond a level that they thought they could go.
Right.
When you bring in professional singers, you open up, say, the horizon of availability of what you can do musically. Right. And one of the things that I always worked on, and then you would probably attest to that, was that we'd hear something and it wouldn't sound quite right, and I would look around and say, well, I think this voice needs to tune this a little bit better. And that meticulous tuning, although can be frustrating, it also recreates a sound quality that generally average choirs do not have, and especially church choirs. Right. Too often a church choir will rely on an organ, and as a result, there's a tendency to consistently and constantly sing slightly flat of the organ. And actually, I've met people who did that all their life and can't stop doing it.
Oh, wow.
So they never actually tune with the choir, even though they think they are in their own head.
Yeah.
But as we are now, let's say when I started at Our Lady of Mount Carmel, we had approximately 175 families. I had a choir of about 6 or 7 people. On an average Sunday, I now have a choir of 18 to 20, wow, who I've been splitting in different ways to mix and match with our section leaders. We have an SATB set of section leaders, and then 2 extra voices, one who's a soprano, we call her a sopralto, yep, and one who is a deep alto who does beautiful work in the alto range, and I mix and match them as needed, especially when we're doing 5-part music. Right. That really helps, and what I love is that having all of these section leaders on staff gives me a chance to really do more of the 5-part music. For example, a lot of Palestrina's motets were 5-part, and people don't realize that there were 2 soprano parts or 2 alto parts. Right. So being able to split those really helps. So we have a staff, and actually I currently have an inactive alto section leader who, again, her husband has a heart problem, so we've given her a leave of absence so that she's not exposed at all.
Right.
And one of the best parts about it is that she's also a world-class viola da gamba player. So we
don't hear about those every day.
We regularly have a period instrument player in our choir, and before the whole outbreak, she was playing about once a month in conjunction with the organ on the viola da gamba, which is a phenomenally sounding instrument. It's a much more mellow sound than a cello, and it has this beautiful characteristic to it. Now, as far as practice schedule, we practice twice a week, once on a Wednesday evening and once on the Sunday before the Mass. And what I find is that that's kind of a bare minimum needed to really keep amateurs on the ball because, well, they don't have a lot of personal time to work on stuff. Right. Even though our part of our program is online where you can access music and MIDI helps to actually assist you in learning your voice part. And if you're kind of a bit music savvy, or if you sang choir in high school, these MIDI helps really help you. You just pull up the score, you click on the MIDI, and you listen to it. And your part is louder than every other part, but you hear the other parts in the background to get the actual contextual movement of the chord of the phrase. And it really tends to help. And those are many of our harder pieces online have MIDI helps. Not all of them. And eventually we'll probably update to the point where all of them will have MIDI helps, even the most simplest ones, for people who know nothing about music.
Right.
As it is right now, because we have explosive growth in our parish right now, we have so much. In fact, our offertories have been up 20% since the virus started. Wow. So I've had some pretty amazing leeway to be able to pull in 2 extra singers from other places where people are just not singing anymore. And I'm looking at the possibility of collaborations with a local gentleman who is a Grammy winner and is just an amazing choral musician. And his knowledge of children's choirs is pretty established. And he's gone through the Royal Choir School methods and has been teaching those. So we're looking to expand to that a little bit, and that's kind of what our future looks like. And honestly, I just want to keep learning Victoria masses and motets and Palestrina masses and motets.
Yeah.
We've been delving bits and pieces into some earlier British polyphony, and I'm currently sort of partially working on two things. One is a performance edition of Dufay's Mass of St. Anthony of Padua, which is a very difficult piece to read by original manuscript. And then also the Salve Regina by Richard Huygens, who existed about 100 years before Palestrina and Victoria, and who wrote one of the most stunning Salve Reginas I've ever heard in my life. And I'd like to get that down onto paper for people to actually really be able to use functionally.
Right. I mean, because that's something that, beyond your work, in the parish, you also spend a great deal of time editing music and going back to first sources of these ancient manuscripts and translating that into something that I can take to my choir and they can read.
That's right, because it's amazing. I mean, even when you take a piece that's sort of a pattern 16-beat measure and you've reduced the note values down to where it's readable and you make it a 4/4 measure, despite the fact that a lot of musicologists roll their eyes and, oh, how could you? Well, yes, okay, it's not original, but it's now accessible to so many more people.
Right.
And I think that that's one of the things that we forget in charity, especially as Catholic musicians. We are not there to promote our own hymns. We are not there to promote our own work. We are not there to promote our abilities. We are there to promote God and God's work. And when I look at the historical context of so much fantastic work, making all of these ancient pieces accessible to modern musicians is such an encouraging thing for me. In fact, I'm just getting ready to finish up a new version of Bird's Visita Quesumus Domine, Visit This House, O Lord, which is a beautiful motet, but very difficult to read in 16-beat measures.
Right.
So I've broken it down into 4-beat measures, and that should be available on our website very shortly.
That's fantastic. That's a great service to the church and to music as a whole, because obviously it's not only church choirs that can use this music, chamber choirs of any sort and schools. Now, before we kind of dive into the next thing I want to talk about, tell me what you're drinking.
Let's see. I'll actually bring the box up. This is a Glen Kinchie 12, a phenomenal scotch that I have not had in many years, but it was on sale at my local store, who already has incredible prices. So when I saw it for $52, I could not bear to let it go.
It's a great deal.
It's deep, it's rich, it's quite a bit less sweet than I expected and remembered, but it has such an interesting Highlands flavor. It's very rich for a Highlands flavor. In fact, most Highlands tend to be lighter. This one, although lighter in character and color, has just great overtone and really more peat than I remember. It's not as peaty as the next scotch I'm going to drink very shortly after I'm done with this.
Well, cool. We'll introduce that then.
That's right.
And I'm working on Ardbeg 10 tonight, which is one of my old standbys. You can't beat the peat smoke of a good Islay malt. So Ardbeg is definitely a favorite of mine. So yeah, cheers, Sláinte.
Cheers.
So let's direct this a little more toward the actual sacred music side of things and kind of like the philosophy of sacred music. You and I think probably see eye to eye on a lot of things with respect to the importance and the value of sacred music in the liturgy. Sure. But let me just put the question to you, as if I had no idea. Why does music in the liturgy even matter? What's the big deal?
Sure. Well, I mean, besides the biblical references where they rejoice to the Lord in song, or play on an instrument, there's the psychological reference of creating art. Every creature wishes to create some sort of presentation. Birds sing, and if that dumb animal can sing, so can we. But even more so, communication is the expression of the soul, and especially communication in song, because it brings out an artistic nature in our speech. Speech is the mathematical representation of what our thoughts are. And if that's the case, then song is the artistic representation of our heart. So that's kind of the Pythagorean and Aristotelian philosophical elements. But even in spite of those, we live in an era where everything's pumped into us. Our iPad pumps into us, our headphones pump music into our brains. And I'm not saying these are bad. This is a great tool, as are this studio equipment that I have next to me. But all of this is for the divine worship to express the soul to God. And why it's so important to sing together is because that is the element of the participation. So realistically speaking, the Kyriale is represented as one of the foundational things that a congregation can sing. And even when you have a polyphonic Kyriale, that is merely taking that art more and more. And the congregation still participates in that sense of prayerful attitude that polyphony can bring out of you. Now, ultimately for me, I think that if you get rid of all of the electronic gobbledygook that you and I are utilizing right now, and we threw it all away, our communication specifically would only be two or three ways. It would be letters, it would be communication face-to-face, and it would be singing together. That's the three levels of communication that we would have. And honestly, God calls for the communication of the soul. And in order to do that, you got to sing. You got to give God that song from your soul. If people did not have songs coming out of their souls, composers would not compose.
Yeah. Well, isn't that an interesting phenomenon too? I mean, when someone's really excited, they sing. Mm-hmm. When they're in love, they whistle or sing. I mean, it is right. It's the kind of the deepest wellings up in our heart are so often expressed in song. Even people who can't find a pitch to save their life, right, they sing when they're happy.
They do. They do. They may not do it well, but they do it.
Right. They do it. They can't help themselves.
Yeah.
So then, with that in mind, we talk so much, you and I both working, in the context of the traditional Latin Mass. Sure. We really are focused primarily on Gregorian chant and polyphony and some traditional hymnody as well. But if we're going to make the statement that this sort of communication with God, this welling up of things in the soul, is expressed in song, why do we stick so closely with those types of music? Why not say Christian rock and praise and worship? And why is it so important that we use these styles in the liturgy?
Well, for me, I go back to Pythagorean's philosophical elements of music, where he accepted that melody, harmony, and rhythm were the three basic elements of music, and those three functionally balanced elements have to be in a balanced order. You can't have a harmony without a melody, and you can't really have a rhythm without a melody either. So melody takes the first role of a philosophical nature. Now, and again, this is all very heady stuff. It's not really even practical in a sense. But if you look at melody, harmony, and rhythm from Pythagoras, and you look out across the world, and you try and find a music medium or a music genre that fulfills that in the simplest way, realistically speaking, Gregorian chant is the only one. So why? But again, these philosophical elements of music in this simplest form. Well, first of all, I think one of the things that we forget about is the characteristics of mystery in chant. Chant has a mysterious character, and again, I've philosophized on this point so long that I've kind of lost the basics sometimes. What makes it spiritual? First and foremost, it is prayerful in the sense that it lifts the soul to God. Even in movies, when they show monasteries in Catholic churches, you might hear Mozart in the background, but more often you hear Gregorian chant.
Right.
Because even Hollywood knows that these things are spiritual.
Right.
And then, of course, you look at plain chant, and then plain chant that as it began to alternate with polyphony, and polyphony being harmonic counterpoint, of course, and we're referring to high and low sacred polyphony as Palestrina presented, and it is a perfect melody, okay, be it 2, 3, or 4 parts, and that perfect melody then woven together with so many other notes, all never being perfectly consonant or perfectly dissonant in a sense until they come to a resolution, and they have this resolution. And it's funny, people think dissonance, they think of the kitten on the keys, or the Hans Zimmer falling asleep on his organ.
Right.
But really dissonance, Palestrina used to call a minor third a dissonance.
Mm-hmm.
So he considered it somewhat less consonant, meaning that the blending of those waves were not amplifying each other, they were de-amplifying each other.
Right.
And you know, I could get into the whole fluid dynamics of it all when we start talking about dissonance and consonance, and I'm sure there have been far better studies and far better scientists who know anything about that than I do. But certainly, when polyphony sung in a chapel designed for that sound has a certain characteristic of movement, it is again even more uplifting to the soul. So that's, to me, is you know, why we focus on that. And you know, interestingly enough, it wasn't just the Second Vatican Council. It was at least 3 other popes that spoke specifically about music and why we have an order of music. Gregorian chant historically was set aside for liturgy. And as a result, it carries the highest place, the primacy of place. It has to have that one endearing quality and that one characteristic that fits into the liturgy and uplifts the liturgy and uplifts the mind of the listener.
Right.
And it's the same thing for polyphony, because polyphony based on chant, and not always, but even though it may be thoroughly composed or thorough composed, and you're looking at something like I know there was a non-parody polyphony, even those still had the polyphonic elements. They still had that, you know, 3 or 4 or 5 or however many voices of independent melody woven together. And that's kind of the magic of polyphony that most people don't really realize. It's actually more complicated than modern hymns.
Right.
People don't realize that.
Well, right, because modern hymns, you know, you can basically build them from a formula more or less with, you know, functional harmony that you can learn in a textbook and write it out. That you know, the great polyphonic compositions didn't come together quite like that.
Nope. Even though these guys studied this stuff, there was a certain level of genius amongst all of those who did these compositions. And I mean, I've been finding more and more obscure polyphony of both Palestrine and Victoria's times that I'm slowly starting to add to our website. For example, a compadre of a slightly older man than Victoria, Villalar, did a Salve Regina that is absolutely fascinating. Technically written for soprano, countertenor, tenor, and bass. It's a really beautiful piece, and that is on our website. Is it a Salve Regina? I think it's a Salve Regina.
That's fantastic.
I'd have to go back and look.
Yeah, but it is so interesting. You know, what you're saying is you know, basically saying the same sorts of things that, as we know, St. Pius X did in Trella Solicitudine, when he said, you know, that we have these 3 basically approved forms of music for use in the Catholic Church in this order: Gregorian chant, sacred polyphony, and hymnody. One of the things I think the real gem out of that document with respect to musical stylings was, and I'm not going to try and quote it word for word, but what the Holy Father said was, more or less, the closer any piece of music is to Gregorian chant in its movement and its form, the more suitable it is for the liturgy. Sure. And the less close it is to Gregorian chant, the less suitable it is. And I mean, so it's so clear to see how that works with chant, obviously, and then also polyphony. Hymnody, though, we're already starting to, you know, kind of delve, you know, a little more toward modern musical ideas rather than chant. But he still obviously gave them a place in the liturgy.
Yeah, interestingly enough, one of the most striking characteristics of any polyphony is the fact that there are no dramatic jumps, or very few dramatic jumps. You might get one on a very special feast day, such as Puernatus es nobis. But notice that first jump is there to tell you a boy is born, and then everything else flows and stays together. Most of the notes remain close to each other in their movement up and down, and they rarely become too jarring. The most jarring ones being in Holy Week.
Right. Yeah. Now, let's turn just a little bit to kind of building and developing music programs, because you've certainly done that at OLMC. That's something I'm in the process of working on here in Harrisburg at Mater Dei, and it's a task that carries its own set of challenges. I don't know if you just have any ideas on, you know, ways to effectively build a music program when you're not starting with a good solid foundation already. I mean, you had a little bit to build from. I had a very little bit to build from, but we didn't have like full music programs when we walked in the door. So what did you do to get to where you are now?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is small building, a lot of it is prayer, but I think that there are 2 things that music directors forget. Number one, this isn't for our glory. Okay? No matter who you are as a musician, if you're doing it to make yourself look good, go find another job. And I don't mean that to be mean and nasty. Go be a symphony music director. Go be a professional chorus director. Because if you really want that type of recognition, you're in the wrong job. We belong taking the best of musical history and applying it to the liturgy as best we possibly can. And quite frankly, I mean, there are so many aspects out of that. One of the first things, and this goes along with young music directors when they're asking me for advice, one of the first things I say is take the music seriously, don't take yourself seriously. If your choir member teases you, don't walk off in a huff. Yeah. If somebody says, I don't like this, you don't get mean and nasty. You laugh it off, you smile and move on, you do whatever it takes to humbly accept that, because in the end, if you're throwing fits, you're putting too much of yourself into it. You need to recognize this as God's program. You need to recognize it first and foremost as God's program. But in that, I encourage people by saying, like, a lot of times I'll have people say, well, I was close enough to the note there. And I say, you know what? It's funny. God asks us for our first fruits in everything, which is why that high altar is made of marble, and why that high altar was carved perfectly, and why those statues were carved perfectly, and why this organ and these organ pipes were put together in a meticulous way, because it was the first fruits of the organ builder, the statue maker, the marble carver, and the church builder that put all of these things together. How dare we as musicians say that something is good enough?
Yeah, and that's a beautiful way to look at that too, Rick. And isn't it a little bit disappointing sometimes when we have the experience of, say, walking into a truly beautiful church, mm-hmm. and then hearing really poor music, or sometimes vice versa, right? Sometimes you'll mm-hmm. walk into the ugliest church on earth, but they have really great music, and then there's that sort of disconnect. It doesn't jive. It doesn't right. work. So.
And I think part of it also is that we have to reference objective sound in clarity. It's an interesting thing that in the 1930s through about the 1950s in America, the bel canto style had taken over even choirs, small choirs. And there are some interesting examples online that I might send to you some point in time, because my choir heard them the other day and kind of had some shudders and shivers. And then this obscure group of Cambridge and Oxford singers got together in Great Britain in the mid-60s and started doing pure tone polyphony with countertenors. And the music community dropped to their jaw and couldn't believe this. And many of the old timers who were believed that bel canto was the only proper way of singing, poo-pooed them and brushed them aside. And then in the early 1970s, a very young music director by the name of Alexander Blachley, who is currently at Notre Dame, I think he's been there ever since, started a group in New York called Pomerium, and they started doing the same thing, creating these amazing pure tone recordings that just blew people away. The sound, how does that sound ring, and how does that chord ring so richly? They could not believe this. And then again, in the early 80s in San Francisco, a guy by the name of Joseph Jennings got together a bunch of countertenors and tenors and basses and created a group called Chanticleer, who started doing that professionally. And they were one of the few first real professional choirs in the United States to do touring, and who have sold millions of records. Right. And since then, we see bits and pieces of groups pop up all over the place, to including an old mentor of mine, Dennis Keene in New York, who started the Voices of Ascension. So there were these groups all over the place, all over, a lot of them are focused in New York, a lot of them are focused in other places. Kansas City has a tremendous singing focal point. Used to be very bel canto. It's kind of moving away from it now. The Phoenix and the Desert Chorales of south of here, south of Denver. And then, of course, the LA Master Chorale, some of the Master Chorales all over the country. And to include the Ars Nova Singers and Denver's own St. Martin's Chamber Choir, sure. of which our director Tim Kruger requires pure tone singing. Yeah. So it's really interesting to see all of this growth of a music medium that seemed to be sort of pushed aside and pushed away, and by the experts called amateur because it didn't have gigantic vibrato.
Right.
So
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's one of the aspects there. I think we need to go back to the question, though. I'm thinking too easily here.
Oh, that's all right. It's what the conversation's all about. But yeah, no, just kind of thinking of how we can really build and develop programs. And one of the things I'll throw out there is I think you and I both have had the good fortune of working for very supportive pastors who
Right.
want good music. But another thing that you and I both have are staff singers. And
Sure.
something I've heard so many times, and I'm sure you've heard it too. I think we referenced it briefly before, but I want to talk about it some more. You hear all these people who will say something along the lines of, "Oh, well, sure, well and good if you're a cathedral, to have a paid organist and paid
Sure.
singers and a professional music director. But in the real world of the parish church, we just can't do that. We can't do that." And then here we sit, two music directors of more or less ordinary parish churches.
Yeah.
And we have staffs. My staff's a little smaller than yours, but we both have paid staff that
Right.
make beautiful music. So how important is that, and how does that help?
Well, two things that need to happen. First and foremost, God bless the volunteers. They work their butts off. They give everything they can of what they know.
Yeah.
But we don't have volunteer priests.
Right.
We don't have volunteer accountants. And when we do, disastrous things happen. We don't have, you might have volunteer janitors, and that's fine. I mean, we all sort of clean our floors one hand at a time, as they say.
Yeah.
But honestly, when it comes to music, and especially knowing the church's hierarchy of music, and I think that this is an era that falls upon the shoulders of the highly educated and the uneducated alike, and that is, oh, this music program just needs to be what I want it to be. And I think that ultimately is one of the most disastrous things that can happen to a music program. But going back to your idea of building something, well, first and foremost, you have to have a pastor who understands the value of music, number one. He also has to have at least the basic understanding that chant is first, then polyphony, then hymns, then local custom. And when it's done that way, music programs build, even poor ones. And I hate to put it that way, but yes, we have a staff. But here's the thing. If you can't afford a staff, go to your local college. One of the things that I had done at one point in time at OMC is I had sent feelers out to singers, young music directors, people who are still studying, maybe somebody who hadn't even gotten their bachelor's yet, and said, we're doing Gregorian chant here, want to check it out? And there's this sort of, perk up of the ears on the dog that say, wow, I want to see that. So that's kind of a really important factor that I give to people, especially if you're somewhere, I don't know if you can hear that music behind me. That would be the washing machine. Especially if you live in a completely rural area. For example, I know that in Dickinson, North Dakota, which is it's the tiniest of towns that feeds this massive agricultural area, they do have a university there with a pretty decent music program. So if you have a church and you're looking to do that, offer a part-time job to one of these undergraduates and tell them, well, look, we're trying to create this very classically oriented Gregorian chant, polyphony, hymns type of music program. Can you help us? We can offer you this much per month for 20 hours a month or something like that. Right. And if you give them that is a beginning. That is a beginning. And that's the only beginning that you can make if you're really going to do it. I mean, if God bless Johnny wants to come in with his guitar and tambourine, tell him thank you very much. But sacred music has to be sacred. It has to be something set aside for sacred music. Yeah. And that's a big part of it. So that's the first thing I say. That's how you begin, especially if you have limited resources. Right. Second, tell this young music director that you just hired part-time, oh, you know what? I saw this database of sacred music. And am I patting myself on the back? Yes, just a little bit. But my whole reason for putting this online is so that young music directors who want to recreate a sacred music system have a resource. Right. Because now all of a sudden you have a resource. Now, again, utilize the tools of the electronic age. If you want to look up the introit puer natus est, type in introit puer natus est into your YouTube, and behold, the oracle of the YouTube will present to you a bunch of recordings, and
Right.
look for the ones that are monastic if you can. Those are usually the best ones. If you can't, try and find the ones that are associated with education, and you'll get a pretty decent idea of what these things are supposed to sound like, and then work towards that sound. So
Right.
here you go. All of a sudden you had nothing, but you start with chant polyphony hymns. You go find a young, eager music director who's eager to start something,
Right.
and tell them you can put your name as music director at our church,
Right.
and boom, there you go. We'll pay you this much each month. And it doesn't have to be huge. It could be whatever you think you can afford at the time. And most young music directors will say, sure,
Right.
because it's an opportunity.
Yep.
It's an opportunity to do something. It's an opportunity to actually grow a program of your own from scratch. And imagine if you have that on your resume as you graduate.
Right.
So seriously, I mean, and it's one of those things too, once you start at once, that person who you hired who's graduating now and moving off to get his master's degree at Juilliard
Right.
can help you choose the next guy
Right.
and spread the word. So
Yeah.
really, I think that's one of the best ways to do it is to reach out to universities, reach out, and it's also an evangelization tool. We've had, out of our music program, 3 of our people were non-Catholic. 1 became Catholic, 1 is becoming Catholic. This is our hired musicians,
Right.
and 1 is kind of not sure to how she feels about it.
Sure.
However,
But there you go. You brought a couple on board.
there's evangelization.
Yeah.
And I would call that a new evangelization. So Rome, we're doing what we're ordered. Thank you.
There you go. That's just it. And you know, that again, doesn't that bring it all home, right? We can sit and talk all day about how we build these programs and, you know, the fascinating elements of the music, but it is all about souls, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we are there in the service of the liturgy, in the service of God, in worship of God, and in service of the faithful in the pews to edify them and to
Right.
really, like we've said a few times, to lift their hearts up out of the world. I mean, that's like goes back to the conversation we already had about musical styles. You know, they shouldn't be worldly. One of the fun questions I always ask my chorister kids when we're talking about what music is or is not appropriate for church is I'll play some recordings for them of very secular music. You know, maybe a piece of jazz, for example. You know, Miles Davis. Just ask them, what's the very first idea that pops into your head when you hear this? And they're always like, oh, it's like a scene from a movie at a bar. I'm like, yeah, right. So if I write a piece of music that sounds like that with sacred words, is it going to be sacred music? Is it going to lift your heart and soul to God? And usually they all kind of get on board like, yeah, no, probably not, because it has such a strong tie to secular culture. And that's why, you know, you just can't go wrong with chant and polyphony.
Yeah.
You just can't.
And polyphony, people think that polyphony is all complicated. It's not. There's a few pieces that are pretty darn simple that even a very simple children's choir could learn. If anything, teach them the simple tone Salve Regina. Teach them a simple tone, all 4 Marian pieces simple tone. And then once that's done, say, hey, there's a more complicated one. You want to learn that?
Let's do that.
These senses of excitement. Now, and that's another thing that young music directors, I think they forget. They jump into it expecting immense results right off the bat. Right. And what you've got to do is you've got to remember that your job is not to teach these people music. It's to be charitable to them. It's to cover them completely with charity. Give an example. I had a soprano come to me not too long ago and say, I'm really worried about this. And I said, you know what? I understand. And I'm so glad you approached me with that. And I'm so glad that you were willing to approach me with that. And I want you to be able to tell me anything that's on your mind. This same soprano, when she first started, 4 times came to me and had a relative die in the first 2 months of her employment.
Oh, wow.
She was in tears saying, I know you want to fire me. And I said, no. I said, we're a family. We're here for you. Go to the funerals. Go sing for the funerals. Come back and sing with us. Yeah. And it was night and day. I mean, she just beamed. I mean, it completely changed how she felt about this. No matter how frustrated you are, don't ever take it out on your singers. They're volunteers. They're there to try and do something very glorious to our Lord. And you can raise them up above where they ever thought they could be by never taking never taking good as good enough. You can always improve a little bit here and a little bit there. Don't be a jerk about it, but do the best you can. Oh, let's fix. Oh, let's do that again. We can make that better. Oh, tenors, that's just a little bit under. Let's see if we can float to that note a little bit more in, sort of a hooty owl sound. And we just develop this. We build this sound based upon that sound that envelops when it becomes a whole unit in polyphony. And that's a big thing that I think a lot of, especially young musicians, they demand.
Right.
Well, stop demanding, ask nice, and if you get a good result, be extremely positive. If you get a bad result, be extremely positive.
Right.
And either which way, I used to joke, especially, and you remember sometimes when we'd have a bad day, and I'd say, well, that was good enough for a Catholic choir.
Yeah. Yeah, I do remember that phrase.
and we would just, and some of my singers would just like, how can you say that? And I said, well, You know what? We do the best we can for our Lord, and He's the one who provides the result.
Yeah, it's true.
So.
Absolutely true.
Yeah.
Very good.
What do you think?
Rick, is there anything else you'd like to share with the universe here?
Oh, yes.
Thoughts on sacred music?
Well, I'd like to share my Scotch of Kill Ely.
Oh, well, that's even better.
And you need to pour yourself. You don't have to pour yourself something different, but you have to pour yourself something.
Oh, absolutely.
So that's another. This is the most peaty Scotch I have ever had.
Really?
But it's not obnoxious. It's just this blast. A few years ago, when my wife and I were driving through Ireland, you would get these peat fires, and the smoke would come into the car, and you'd just get this burst smell of the peat, and your brain would be like, "Whoa!"
Yeah.
And when I smell this bottle of Scotch, I smell Ireland. It is just absolutely. It's amazing. It has this deep peat smell that just continues, and it's as I said, it's the most peaty Scotch I've ever had, but the least most obnoxious peat I've ever had.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it really is an interesting Scotch. Obviously, it's an Ely. It's Kill Ely.
Mm-hmm.
And again, 1.7 ounce dram to make it perfect. And I might add a little water, which actually in some cases, in some Scotches, it'll dry them out. But with other Scotches, it sweetens them up. With this one, it tends to sweeten it up a little bit. Also brings out even a little bit more peat, which is unusual. Let's see, music, sacred music. The organ is not evil.
Thank you. I would have just turned this whole thing off right now, Rick, and put it in the dustbin.
A friend of mine actually has correspondence with some traditionalists who are convinced that the organ is a modernist thing and should never be allowed at Mass, that polyphony should be absolutely limited, and that chant should pretty much domineer 90 or 95%. And I think to myself, wow, what a way to trample on 1,000 years of church history. Because the organ is called the glorious grandfather of all music. And it's true. The pipes were initially designed to mimic human voices because in some cases, some people couldn't sing and they needed an instrument to richen their voice or to add tone to the line of music so that anybody who had trouble singing that line of music could follow that instrument. Right. And it's interesting that we have so many different aspects of the organ, and you know more than I do even, pipes that mimic instruments that mimic certain voices. Right. For example, a reed that would imitate an oboe, which would then also imitate a medium-sized voice of a tenor, maybe. Right. And it had that sort of sonorous feel to it, with lots and lots of overtones and beautiful floating sounds.
Yeah.
So.
And you have a fantastic organist now, John. He's really fantastic. So, I mean, that's another member of your staff that adds a lot to your program.
And no, you're not allowed to steal him. I wept the day that you left, Patrick. I did. I mean, I'm blessed with phenomenal organists all the way up to this point. But I did. I missed. I knew that you had to spread your wings, but I will drink your Scotch any day.
And vice versa.
One piece of advice to give a new, eager young music director: don't take yourself seriously. Treat everything with an air of charity.
I think that's good. I think that's really good. We can't take ourselves too seriously, or you can really become a miserable person. Mm-hmm. I mean, the first rule of the church is the salvation of souls, and the best way to do that is charity. So,
absolutely,
that's good, solid advice, Rick. And Yeah, I think we'll wrap up there. And
Right.
thank you so much, Rick, for joining me. And hopefully we'll have you back. We'll do this again.
Well, I hope you enjoyed the screams and yells of my children in the background.
Oh, of course.
And I think that's Joey pounding on my door. He's not quite 2. But yes, the terrorist Joey. So
the joys of the Catholic family.
It is a large Catholic family. I am incredibly blessed. And thank you, Patrick, for this interview. I mean, you may not be a music editor and have massive music libraries, but what you do is another tool of the church that, in my opinion, is absolutely warranted and needed in today's world. Not just with Chant Talk, but of course, the way you expand in multimedia what you do at Mater Dei, because I think that element, that multimedia element, is something that I'm not 100% good with. So you take up the slack for that, and when we work together like this, I think it creates this sort of plugs in the holes of this giant shield of sacred music that we have. And I think that
God provides. I mean, we all have our different areas of focus and strength, and it's really great for me. I love to be able to collaborate with you via especially this multimedia. That way we can sit here and do this tonight. But also, these kind of networks that we build in sacred music. It's really a small world, as you know as well as anyone. But like when we had the big pontifical mass that you came and sang for, the ordination for Father Thomas. So you'll come here and help me, and I'll stop by and see you when I'm out there. And it's a great network to really have in sacred music. And I think, I think there's a lot of merit in that.
Excellent.
Very good.
All right,
well, Rick,
Maestro.
I really appreciate it, and as always, all the best to you and the family. And
thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. All right. We'll see you soon.
See you soon.